business of failure, right? There's a lot that can go wrong. We need to make sure we mitigate as much of it as possible.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm Anthony. I'm founder and CEO at Seed Legal. So instead of going to a law firm, I've built a startup that disrupts all of that. So all the legals for fundraising, hiring people, and so on. There's a platform. I'm not here to pitch that, but I hope it's the exact solution to the problem that you have. I'm also not really going to talk about legals because legals are super boring. And every startup idea is different, but every startup journey in terms of fundraising, hiring, the things you've got to do are remarkably self-similar. So I'm going to go through getting investment ready, finding investors, valuing the company, protecting your IP, and a few other things. And in the space of the next 20 or 30 minutes, you should have all the things for that journey for what to do for your company. So next slide. I used to, years ago, head up BBC iPlayer. After I left the BBC, I built a startup. Next slide. I sold it. Next slide. I built another startup. Next slide. Sold it. Next slide. And got tired of paying lawyers and built Seed Legal. So we're about 150 people now, and about 1 in 3 or thereabouts of all early-stage funding rounds are on our platform. So I've talked to lots and lots of founders. Everyone, myself included, a few times, starts at the same point in the journey. You have an idea, you're out running, whatever it is, and now what are the steps between this idea and a funded company and a product that consumers love? So looking at the agenda, I wasn't here earlier, but looking at other slides, everything today was about validating the idea. And I'm just going to talk about this for 60 seconds. So one of the things you realize as a founder is you're super passionate about something and you think the problem to be solved is building it, hiring a team, getting investment. And actually only after you've done that, you realize the real problem is getting users, customers to want to then pay for it. So what you want to do, and you've probably heard this several times during the day, but to me it's really important at the beginning, because otherwise what happens is you get started, you get people to follow your mission, you get investment, and then a year later or 2 years later, you wake up in a cold sweat going, oh my God, nobody wants this. It was like a vanity idea. So you want to validate it. And to validate it, my favorite book is called The Mom Test. Who here has read The Mom Test? Okay, okay, great. Yeah. So it's called The Mom Test because you normally ask your mother, hey, I want to make this GPS-enabled, blockchain accessible bicycle lock. If my bike's stolen, don't you think it's an awesome idea? And your mother goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. But my son's such a clever boy. Of course it's a good idea. So you've asked the wrong person the wrong question, and you get told it's fabulous, and then you go build it. And instead, it's about asking the real users, how much did you pay for it? Have you got one already? Have you found any that don't work? And then, from that, understand if there's real market. But enough about that. I just couldn't resist talking about that. So the next thing is, what happens is you're out, have an idea, meet up with friends in the pub, and informally you're now agreeing to go ahead with this idea. And at some point it crosses over from a hobby. Hey, yeah, let's do this awesome bicycle locking, great idea. And then you start getting designs, and you start spending money, and at some point it goes from a hobby to something that you now want to somewhat do full time. So the first step is to go incorporate your company. The good news is in the UK, it costs you £12. You can incorporate in about 30 minutes on Companies House. It's like the easiest in the entire world to incorporate a company. Once you've incorporated, you've got to do annual filings and a few other things that comes with some baggage, but it's really easy to do. And the advantage of incorporating is you've now got this entity that can continue as people come and go. And one of the first set of people that might come and go is your co-founder. So sometimes you're a solo founder, but more often, my stats indicate the majority of companies have got 2 founders. Sometimes 3. If it's more than 3, it usually falls apart. One of them leaves. You know, for a founder, my suggestion is, again, not a legal topic, I think there are 3 roles to fill in a company, which is the domain expert, the hustler, the person who knows the problems, like the doctor, dialysis machine, mother, needs to change world, but they're often not very good at building and shipping things. So the second role is this person who can help ship things, often the CTO or the tech lead or product lead. And the third one is the Mr. or Ms. Money, somebody who's going to help make it a viable business, do the bills, get investment. And if you think about yourself, which one or more of these are you? And you may find, I'm like the domain expert, or I might be the tech person. So you now want to find people who will complement you and do the opposite. So at Sea Legals, I'm kind of the tech product guy. My co-founder was more the visionary person on it. We can both do the money side of things, and it works well with the two of us. So, but when you find a co-founder, things often don't work out. And our data anecdotally suggests maybe like 10% of the time, maybe more early stage founders split up. So to come to the slide topic, a founder agreement, which you can do on Sea Legal, free, is a legal document between each person and the company. And it says that I'm getting, let's say you incorporate your company on Companies House and you make 50 shares each out of 100 shares. And it says, if I leave anytime in the next 3 years, then I have to give back some fraction of my shares. It's called reverse vesting. And that's super important because what happens quite frequently on Sea Legals in our web chat, we get a message going, my co-founder and I have split up, what to do next? And we'll say, do you have a signed founder agreement? Great, let's look at what the wording says, and then we'll work out how to get back to the unvested shares. But if you don't, then it's a big bum fight and people will fight over the intellectual property and so on. So the founder agreement says if you leave in a certain time, I have to give back, transfer back some fraction of my shares, proportional to how long I've been around. It also says all the intellectual property that we've done before we started the company, while moving over together or afterwards, belongs to the company. So if someone leaves, there's not a bun fight about who owns the domain name or the idea or the code or whatever. And it also contains non-disclosure and non-solicitation clauses. So your co-founder can't go, I'm out of here, I'm just going to grab the team and go make my own one. So philosophically, it's saying the company is the vehicle that will go ahead and might come and go. But this is really essential. And even if you don't think about it initially, when it comes to raising investment, any professional investor is going to insist that you do these agreements. And often they lead to hard questions. Who's the CEO? Who's the CTO? You know, what's the equity split? And the longer you leave these hard questions, the harder it becomes. If the two of you met in the pub and you agree like, yeah, 50-50, 40-60, but wait, later on, if you're raising money at £1 million valuation, suddenly those questions become harder to answer. So founder agreement is thing number one. Next slide. So the next thing is you now want to, let's say a couple of co-founders get together and you now want to get some more team members. But the problem is you've got no money. You're funding it yourself. Our Sea Legals data suggests founders put a median of £26,000 of their own money into the business, because no one really invests on a PowerPoint. You have to build something, even a prototype will knock out to show. So you want to get some people do some work for you, but you don't have much. So maybe you don't want to pay them at all, or maybe you're going to pay them less than market rate. And the way you compensate them is by giving them share options, stock options, as the Americans say. And to do that, you might, well, you can give them equity in one of two ways. You can give them some shares, or you can create an option pool and give them share options. So I'll tell you in 60 seconds which of them to do when. So right at the beginning, when the shares have got no value, you just started your company, you can give people shares. And as founders, you'll have shares. But later on, once you've got a funding round and once the shares have a value, if you give an employee shares, it creates a tax liability for them and a tax liability for the company. So once you've got a value in the company, you will now use share options and you'll make an option scheme. And for employees, it's called an EMI option scheme. And I can help with all of that later on. There's no rush on that now. And then you'll give people share options, and always in the same way that you wouldn't pay your developer their entire annual salary on January the 1st. Likewise, if anytime you give somebody shares or share options, you'll always say they will vest over so many years. Or maybe sometimes for milestones for an advisor. If you do this or deliver this, I'll give you so many more shares. And you can do these agreements as well and make sure everything is sort of suitably papered, because the difficult ones are where people just do it informally And then once the company's got a value, suddenly the person's going, oh, wait, I was promised so many shares and now it's worth £300,000 and I should spend some time with lawyers to find. That doesn't happen very often, but doing these papering it, so to speak, earlier is better. Next slide. Okay, so this is a problem you're not going to come up with for a little while, but at some point, when you start giving your employees these share options, you're going to create what's called an option pool. So what is an option pool? So when you incorporate it on a company's house, let's say there are two founders, and you've got 50 shares each, so you've got 100 shares altogether. And you might make a 10%, so it's called option pool. So you might make a reservation saying the next 10 shares we give out, or we can give out up to 10 more shares to team members. And that's sort of creating a reservation so you can happily easily give these share options to team members. And you will normally be asked to do this by your investors at the time you do your first funding round. Because when you create a share option pool, it essentially dilutes the previous shareholders. So if you are the founders and you own collectively 100% of the business and you make a 10% option pool, you now own 90% of the business. And so investors, when they invest in your round, they don't want to be diluted right afterwards. So they say, please create what's called free money option pool. It sounds technical, we'll get there later, but it's worth remembering that maybe a 10% size option pool is quite common in the UK. So when you think about the size to make, sometimes Americans talk about 20%, when an investor might push it to 20%. That's diluting you a lot, probably unnecessarily. So maybe a 5 to 10% option pool is to go. Next slide. So the next thing are patents and trademarks. So I've got 13 patents, and I can tell you they're a waste of money. So they, usually with the patents, it takes you, my batting average is probably about 30% success rate from filing it to actually getting it. So on Dragon's Den, when they go, yeah, I've got worldwide patents, it's nonsense. They would have spent hundreds of thousands to get there and taken years. What they've probably done is filed the patent application in a few countries. It usually takes like 5 years to get it. They cost typically £20,000 for the UK and 30 for the US, and another 50 for Europe and so on. So they probably filed applications and they're nowhere near getting it. So if you are a med tech and you do, AstraZeneca or something, patents are going to be important. But if you're doing software, firstly, you probably can't get a patent on it. And secondly, it's a giant use of your time and money that you could be doing the most important thing, which is building something that your customers are going to want to buy. So to me, maybe way later think about patents, but at Sea Legals, even with quite a substantial annual turnover and 150 people, when I reviewed it with our board and our patent attorney, it was concluded it was a waste of time doing patents. Trademark is different. So trademark is your company name or logo, your brand names. And that's quite inexpensive to do. You go to the government's ico.gov.uk website, quite a good website, and you file a trademark application that costs you £240. The first thing you'll see when you do a trademark application is there are lots of categories, like 200 categories or something. And I think the categories were invented in Queen Victoria's time, because they're like 12 of them for knitting rolls and 2 of them for the internet. So most times you get like category 34, 42, 49, which is basically internet services. So it's possible when you trademark something, you trademark in a particular category. So you could have Apple, the computer company, and Apple, the Granny Smith company. You don't go getting Apple as a trademark. That would be a bad one to do. But as a general concept, you can have different companies coexisting in different categories. So having a trademark means that somebody else can't send you a cease and desist notice to tell you to stop using your product or company name. But it's a double-edged sword, because when you file your trademark application, the trademark office will write to anyone with a similar sounding name, because trademarks are done phonetically. So if you call it Flickr without the E at the end, or Flickr with the E at the end, ER, it's the same trademark. And so the trademark office will write to everyone with a similar sounding name And they are then sort of forced to object because otherwise they let you get your trademark. So by filing an application, you might flush out of the woodwork people who would otherwise not care about you. And suddenly they're forced to respond, and then you've got problems. So I invested in a startup a while back. We didn't have very much money. I was the only investor in it. And somebody, wrote us a cease and desist. We ended up after about a year backwards and forwards, sort of agreeing things, but I wish in retrospect I probably had never filed the application. So it's worth, so that's your 101 on the trademarks. And the other thing is intellectual property. So you might think I have to file copyright things on my code. Don't bother with any of that. Copyright simply subsists or exists because you have it. And in all the agreements you make with your people you hire, an advisor or consultant or employee, it will always say the IP, intellectual property, belongs to the company. Maybe you can put a little C copyright notice at the end. I certainly don't bother, but don't really, in my view, spend time trying to write copyright code and stuff like that. Just the fact you've got it and the people who've worked on it have a signed contract with the company is sufficient. And be careful if you're using open source code. Some open source licenses require that you open source the entirety of your tech stack. So be a bit careful on that. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk, this is not strictly legal, it's about finding investment. Because of course, at some point you get bored, paying the development of your company. Your spouse starts wondering where these thousands of pounds a month are going. You could have bought something you was bored within that time. And so at that point, it's time to raise investment. So what's the time to raise investment? Well, the right time to raise investment is when the rate at which you can grow your business, hire people, whatever it is, by marketing, is limited by your ability to fund this. And you've created enough value in the company that you can find investors who will invest at a high enough valuation so you won't dilute yourself substantially. So if you're looking to get money, that basically you've got the following options. You can get grant funding from Innovate UK or something like that, which is great because they just give you money. But the unfortunate reality is there's something like a 3% or something success rate. So you may, for some of the smart grants and so on, so you may waste months hoping to get grant money and nothing that arrives. So nice to do, but I wouldn't bet my company on. Number two, you can think you can borrow money from the bank, but you can't borrow money from the bank unless your company has revenue to repay it. Otherwise, you're for sure going to go bankrupt. And a bank, unfortunately, just doesn't lend to startups because they're only lending to you when they see you've got a profitable business. But you need the money to get there, so that's no good at all, which leads to equity fundraising, which is where people invest in your business, you give them shares, so you're giving them a fraction of your business, and they're giving you money. So, who, yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what happened with the screen.
That's okay. So who here is familiar with SEIS and EIS? All right, so a few people, maybe a few more. So this is your friend. So the UK government has got a fantastic scheme called the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, and this has got a bigger brother, the Enterprise Investment Scheme. And this means if you raise money from angel investors and your company qualifies, which the vast majority of startups would, when an investor invests in your company, they can deduct from their taxes this tax year or last tax year 50% of the amount they've invested. So if you go to friends, family, whatever it is, and someone invests £20,000, they can subtract £10,000 from their taxes, which is awesome. And if they keep the shares for 3 years and sell it after that, they pay no capital gains tax on the gain. And if your company folds, they can also write off the rest of their investment. So this fuels the UK startup ecosystem. I'd say 80% of all investment raised in first and second funding rounds are angel investors investing personally and getting tax benefits. And because it so de-risks it for the investor, it means if your business doesn't work out, they might still invite you for Christmas dinner. So you want to become, you want to show your investors the magic words, because most pro-investors will know about this, that you qualify for SEIS and EIS, and you can Google that, there's a lot of information available. And many angel investors will only invest in businesses that qualify. So there's something, so an investor might go, how do I know that you can give me this tax incentive? So your business may qualify, but if you want to give them a letter that says you will qualify, this is something called SEIS, EIS, Advance Assurance. And there you do an application to HMRC, and you give particulars of the business and the thing you're working on and the risk capital and a bunch of other things, and you get back a letter going, you know, based on what you said, you can qualify. And now you can go and talk to your investors to go, we've got our advance assurance. So this advance assurance is a comfort letter for investors. It's not legally required, but often in an investor conversation is along the lines of, hey, I'm raising. Awesome. Have you guys got SEIS? Great. Have you got your advance assurance? Yep, I'm in. And if not, it's like, okay, call me when you've got it. I'll come back later. So getting your advance assurance is a useful thing to do, and we can help with that on CVs. But your goal now is to find investors. And the big mistake most founders make is, of course, you've no idea where to find investors. So you do a bit of Googling, and you find all these funds, you know, Index Ventures and Seed Camp and others, and you go and write to them all, and you never hear back. Or if you're lucky, you get a meeting or a pitch, and inevitably they go, love what you're doing, come back later. So the comeback later is the story of your life when you talk to a VC. And the reality is fundraising falls into two categories broadly: raised from individuals, angel investors, is the person investing anywhere on a crowd platform from £100, but mostly when you raise from people individually, maybe £5,000 to £50,000 individually, and they will invest and look for their tax benefits. And they will invest based on liking you and your idea. You're nowhere near building it or revenue and so on. The VCs aren't investing their money, they've got investors in their fund, and they've got an investment committee. And they typically de-risk it by waiting until you've built something and they've got customers and they've got revenue. So you get trapped in this loop if you Google the best VC funds or something like that. They heavily oversubscribe to incomings, and they'll, if you like to look at your pitch deck, and they'll go, great. And how much, you know, what's your revenue? You go, oh, I think that. And they go, well, how many users do you have? You go, you built it. You go, no, I'm hoping to use your money to build this. And they go, that doesn't really work. Go get that and then come back later. That can be a bit disappointing. So really what you want to do is figure out now that you're going to raise from angel investors. So the next thing is, how much do you need to raise? So I think, to me, it always goes something like this. Fundraising is hard. You don't want to do it often. You know, you need to raise it up for a while. So how many people do I need? Well, let's say there's 2 founders, and I need 2 developers, a data person, a salesperson, marketing, and a designer. I always come up with like 8 people. And so let's say it's going to cost £50,000 a year per person. So for a year, £400,000, and I need to raise the last 18 months at least. So that's £600,000. So if I'm raising £600,000 and I don't want to give away too much of my company, the Seedleagle's data, and here let's jump to the next slide. And the one after this, okay. Next slide. Says that when you fundraise, you have to keep the valuation, and you're selling some shares in the business, and the investor's getting some shares. And so you're giving away a certain amount of business. And the amount of the business you're giving away is proportional to the amount you're raising and your valuation. So let's say you're raising £100,000, and the company's value before the fundraise was £1 million. You decided somehow or other it was £1 million. After the fundraise, the investors will own £100,000 out of what is now £1.1 billion. So the investors will own 9.09%. So our data on Seedleagle shows that companies sell a median of about 15%. Oh, that's kind of cool. I won't touch it. So a median of 15% equity. So you might find a standard pattern in the UK is somebody raising £150,000 on maybe £1 million valuation, for example. or maybe raising £50,000 on a £500,000 value. So you find these company stages, and that's where I started by saying every idea is different, but the phases of the company are very self-similar. So you may put some of your own money into the company to build it initially because no one else will. And then you might raise £50,000 from friends and family. And then you may raise £200,000 from angel investors to get your product to market. And then once it's launched, you might now raise a seed round of £500,000 or £700,000 from early stage VCs and more angel investors. And once you've got traction and revenue, you might do a Series A round and raise £3 million or more. So you might say the formula is each time you grow the business, you're going to raise 3 to 5 times the amount that you raised previously at 3 to 5 times the valuation. And if each time you're diluting by, let's say, you're giving away 15% of the business, after 3 funding rounds and creating a 10% share option for, the founders will still own more than 50% of the business. So you might think your goal is, after 3 funding rounds, I'm ready to sell the business, or the business is now profitable and I don't raise again. And if you dilute by 15% each time, the founders become majority shareholders, which is better than being a minority and investors. So these are your fundraising patterns. And that means, so going back to my example, you said I've got 8 people, so I need £600,000. If I'm diluting by 15%, I basically multiply the amount that I want to raise by 5. So the investors will own 1 in 6 afterwards. So if I'm raising £600,000, my valuation might be £3 million. But your problem is you now go to investors and they go, oh, I love what you're doing. That bicycle lock sounds awesome. You know, what's the valuation? You go, £3 million. And you go, great. How many have you sold? And you go, no, not there yet. And so then there's another one that we come back later. So you may have to modify what you're doing to raise a lot less to get started. And so often what happens is founders think, I'm going to raise a big amount. But what turns out is that this is time and this is the amount raised. You'd like to raise a big amount literally tomorrow, but it turns out there's a lot of kissing of frogs, and then months later you manage hopefully to raise that. You might find much better to raise in a stepwise fashion, a smaller amount now, and then top up more later. So you don't literally need £600,000 tomorrow. You just needed £20,000 to go hire the first person or pay some dev agency or something. So is there a different way? If you go to the next slide, there's something that I've coined the term agile fundraising. So I joke that, like in 2018, my goal at Sea Legal was to help you do a funding round. And in 2019, my goal is to help you not do a funding round. So what do I mean by that? So normally what happens, you spend ages trying to find a whole bunch of investors. You get together and sign a term sheet, do a shareholder agreement, articles, and all the documents for the funding round. It's like going on holiday with a whole bunch of people and waiting for the last person to get on the bus, and the bus can only leave when the last person is there and full. But is there a different way of doing it? And what if you could raise small amounts, then you do a pitch session and you meet some investors and you're out talking to people and somebody goes, love what you're doing, can I invest 10 million? Instead of going, come back in July, you go, yes, I can send you a document to take your investment now. So pattern number 1 is companies are now raising before a funding round. And the other thing is, after a funding round, you now have PR and you can get some press about it. And suddenly people going, hey, I've missed the round, can I invest? And instead of saying, come back next year, you can go, yes, I can top up the round. So the combination of raising before a round and topping up a round, I call agile fundraising. And there's now more money raised by companies in the UK and Sea Legal outside of the round than in a round. So the pattern has completely changed. And the document that you use to raise before a round, we call it a seed fast. So a seed fast is funding round is you give me money and I will give you shares at a valuation that we agree. A seed fast, also known as an advanced subscription agreement, says you're going to give me money and I will give you shares when I do my funding round in a few months' time at a valuation that I'll agree with the pro-investors later. But because you're coming in early, I'll give you a 10 or 20% discount. And if I don't do a funding round in 6 months, to protect your interests, I'll give you shares at a 2 million valuation. So these documents are actually very simple because you don't have to agree the valuation now. You don't need to do the complex paperwork now. You're kicking that into the long grass and you can get the funds now in order to go off and build the products. So these are extremely popular. And again, this is agile fundraising. So I think this is the last slide and you're standing here. with
Yeah,
two
I'm
slides
just.
lined up. So we're not going to
Many
talk about it first, and we'll go to the next slide, and that is it. So I hope that was helpful. You can hit me up on LinkedIn, Anthony Rose, or Anthony@seedlegals.com if you've got any questions. Thank you.
There are some questions, but I'll wait you one thing about the questions. Legals and fundraising.
Yes.
I bet you most of this audience are going to
Yeah.
ask questions about money. They're all going to want money.
Of course.
No, it's not, but one of the big messages
Yeah.
that came across, and I hope came across for everybody else, is unless you get the legals right, unless you forward plan what you're doing and putting the right structure in place, the fundraising part's not necessarily going to go to plan.
I look at it differently because legals are the solution to a problem. But the key thing is to understand what the problem is and understand the bigger picture. So really, the term sheet, the Shell agreement is just like that thing. Well, the difficult part is getting investors, creating a pitch deck that are going to want investors to invest and coming up with the valuation and work out how much you want to raise. And the rest just sort of solves that problem. At least that's my goal, to make the rest solve that problem. So you focus on the things that are unique to you. Questions?
1 second, just before we do
Oh.
questions, for the online audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Questions?
Yeah.
In the room.
Yes.
have
You've got clipboards. It's
Go there, yeah.
dangerous. Okay.
Have two questions.
Sure.
First one is for the patent and trademark.
Yeah.
Is based on our idea first or after production that we do the patent?
Okay.
Because on our idea, we know how we can how our package will be for the label, and then we go to the local market and the national market. Through our idea.
Okay, hold on the second question. I'll answer the first one. So, trademark is just on a word or a logo. So that's quite easy, Seed Legals, go off and get a trademark so no one can call their company Seed Legals. A patent is an invention. It's not an implementation, it's an invention and essentially an idea. But you can't, the patent office will only give you a patent if you also provide enough description on how to build this. And here's the problem, which is in the software world, typically what in my previous patents, I would spend ages and lots of money getting the patents, and it would take years. And then one day I'd come into the office and go, team, awesome news, we've got the patent. And they go, what was that? No, we don't do that anymore. We've moved on. So things move quite quickly in the software world. But so you're essentially saying your patent, you're claiming a method of finding a bike when it's goes missing in a city, and then you have to, of course, show how it's built, because otherwise people just make stuff up. So that's the first question. Second question.
Yeah, okay, before I go to the second question, so it means what, if it's amazing, for instance, our company is present in Africa, and then what we would like to Africa, a production to enter the market in Europe and
Right.
International market. So do we necessarily need also patent for all this, or based on what?
Yeah, great point. So you'd have to have a patent in the areas that you think it's worth getting a patent for. So if you think most of your sales are in Europe, or a good fraction of sales in Europe, you get a patent for Europe. And there's a single European patent office that can cover a range of European countries. You do it separately for the US, separately for the UK. I don't know if there are any coalitions of groups in Africa, but you may decide it's just not worth it in Africa because you're just not going to be able to litigate it anyway there. And you know, a patent is only worth as much as you can afford to spend litigating it later, which is the other thing people often don't realize. All right, thanks for those questions. Question, you promised me a question earlier. So let me do that again.
Won't be illegal. I think it's mostly about company evaluation.
Yeah.
So basically, to evaluate the company, we need a team together.
Right.
Speaking about startups, most of the startups, let's say, they're in the process of development. How would you evaluate the company, or
Okay.
how is the company evaluated before that company will even start trading?
Got it. Okay. So valuation broadly works something like this, which is one day when your company has revenue and you've got a spreadsheet showing month on month or year on year growth, then investors will simply look at your spreadsheet, almost not care what the company does, and they apply a multiplier of your annual revenue based on growth. So if your revenue is flat, they might say, I'll buy your cheese shop for 3 times your annual revenue. If you're growing at 2x year on year, maybe they'll say, I'll buy you for 10 times your annual revenue. And it would depend if you're making profit or loss. But basically, when you've got revenue, the valuation is often some formula based on the revenue. But of course, if you don't have revenue, your valuation can't be 0. That's no good. You give away 100% of the company. So now people are going to use fuzzier metrics. But actually, it may turn out that it's not metrics at all. Investors just know that there are certain sort of groups that they would see. So somewhat facetiously, it would be like 2 founders get together, have an idea, okay, $500,000 valuation. Oh, you've built something, prototype, okay, 1 million valuation. You've got some users, 1.5 million. You've got some revenue, 2 million. And north of maybe £20,000 a month revenue, £20,000 a month, so £250,000 a year revenue, you now might start switching to a revenue multiplier. But the point is, early on, people are making a bet, right? You can't value, you spent a few weekends on the company, you built something, you spent 20K, how can it suddenly be worth a few £100,000? But the point is, it has to be, because otherwise you couldn't raise money without giving away too much to the company. So the company valuation, in a sense, and it's important to explain this to investors, is often, it's not about what you've built so far, it's based on the future potential. So if your first funding round is at £1 million valuation, and you're giving away 15%, and your next funding round is at 3 million valuation, because things have now moved on, everyone gets diluted, but the investor now has 3x or minus any dilution, return on investment, which is fantastic. So for investors, it's, apart from if they just love you or they love the idea, but for a pro investor, it's a numbers game. And they will see that a certain percentage of companies don't work out, but the ones that do, then they get 10x their money back or more, which pays for the ones that don't. So really, it's not to, if you're thinking you're going to persuade your investor that the weekends of work you put in are now worth £1 million, it's going to be much harder, much better to go, this is just based on the dilution multiples, this is what it is, and actually this is samples for every company at the stage, more or less. Question?
I'm just wondering if research and development and tax benefits could add benefits to the mix.
Right, great question. I didn't talk about that. So the government's also got a nice system that for the company, if you spend money on R&D, and in other words, it's almost all stuff that a company does, it's salaries for people who work on the coding, even on the design and so on, not sales and marketing typically. You can write to the government at the end of your tax year and so on, and you can get back sort of roughly a third of the amount you spent on eligible R&D activity. The amounts have gone down a bit, now more like 27% now, but it's often really important. You can think about it as bridge financing. So if you've raised £1 million and you spend most of that, on team working on your products, then maybe you can get back £250,000, which is fantastic to help until your next round. The money, the latest changes to the legislation really needs to be spent on team members in the UK. So if you're offshoring, you probably would be able to have eligibility. But it is an important thing that helps the company, many companies, between funding rounds. There was a question back. there.
Time for one last
One
question.
last question. All right, who's the last question?
I have a question for the. Recommend to us your books, your written books, some books for us.
Sorry, I can't.
Recommendations, recommendation about.
Recommendation books
Do you have any books to recommend to us?
or
Your niche?
so for idea validation is where my niche is.
Which books would be best for us?
It's Lean Startup.
Yeah, we often work in the earlier part
Okay.
of building products. I can't think off the top of my head. We use Canvas, all the stuff that Bill, where Bill put up about books, Bill Murray, and the
Okay, we would make some one book, two books, couple of books.
no.
The book that you
The long
The
test.
Mum test.
The mom test.
Long-
Recommend us to read. We will look by ourselves.
I
Okay.
She's saying that if you have any books that you can recommend them.
Yeah, I don't.
You can buy the book and read about it. That's what I'm saying.
There are thousands of startup books. The problem is which ones
Yeah,
jump to mind.
it's- Okay, well, I think we need to stop there. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Thank
If
you
you've got
very
any
much.
questions, feel free to ping me directly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we're going networking again.
We're also having a break as well, a coffee break. So you've got